Reconciliation, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners, which we do on our special evenings, but because it's Reconciliation Week this week, I think it's very appropriate to acknowledge the traditional owners of the country on which we meet today. That's the Jagera people of the Turrbal Nation, and recognise their continuing connection to the land, the water, and the waters and the culture they have. We pay our respects to their elders, past and present, and emerging. Now, I think everybody here is familiar with the premises, so you know where the toilets are, ladies that way, gentlemen that way, and we have emergency exits. We have emergency exits in that corridor there if anything happens, which I'm sure it won't. And I am a warden, and a fire warden, and Pamela sitting there is also one if we need be. So I think that's the official announcements. If you do have a mobile phone, could you please make sure it's turned off or onto silent? Thank you. I better do that to my own over there in the bag soon. Now, just for this evening, as I'm sure you're aware, thank you for those members here tonight who made the trip and who come to hear the oration in person. We're certainly glad to have you here. But as you've known in the past few months, we were able to Zoom our presentations, and we will be doing that again this evening. Lydia will be monitoring that. We do have about 18 people registered to participate on Zoom tonight for the lecture. I don't think they're all here yet. And if you are there on Zoom, most welcome. Thank you for registering. And there are some non-members too who have registered. Maybe a few from Interstate as well. And there will be opportunities for questions at the end of Alaric's talk, both from the floor, of course, but also via the chat room of the Zoom, which Lydia will be monitoring. So if you do have a question on the way, please, if you're on Zoom, type it in, and we'll look at those questions at the end. Now, as I said, tonight is a very special occasion because it's our award of the Thompson Medal. And in the program that you had on your seats, you'll see that as well as the program for the evening, you'll see on the back page, there's a little bit about Dr. James Park Thompson, whom the award is named after, and that's what we're awarding tonight. But I should say, and you'll note that tonight's recipient of the award is for 2020. That's last year. And that's because Alaric Maud, our speaker, and our recipient of the medal, was very generous in presenting a lecture last year in June for his award. But of course, because of the COVID restrictions, Alaric is from Adelaide, we had to do it all by Zoom. So first off, I want to thank Alaric for doing another lecture for us in person and for coming to Brisbane. We always intended to have him come to receive the award, but again, it wasn't possible last year. So again, Alaric, thank you for doing 2 lectures for us for this award. And we don't have an award for 2021 because, of course, Alaric is presenting his award tonight for last year. So that's the background of why we're doing it this way. And you'll also note that there's a piece there on the second page, information about Alaric. And what I will do now is hand over to David Wadley, who's the chair of our Honours Committee, just to say a few words about the decision of the committee to award this medal and this award to Alaric. Thank you, David.
Got it. Okay. Thanks very much, Rafni, and good evening to all members, and thank you for coming along. I'll say a few words first about the Honours Committee, if I may. It consists of Lewis Scanlon and Dr. Duncan Cook from the Australian Catholic University, Professor John Holmes, who is here tonight, Emeritus Professor John Holmes, and Les Isdale, who will be known to many of you, I'm sure, and I chair this group. So some time ago, in another world, I think it was in November 2019, we had our meeting, and we talked extensively about a couple of nominees for the Thompson Medal, never thinking it was going to come as far as this. And eventually, after some discussion, Alaric's name was put forward, and the committee voted unanimously with one abstention, as a conflict of interest, that the award should be offered to Alaric. And he generously accepted the award, so that we've got 2 for 1, really. Alaric's previous talk, what makes geography geographical, and we'll talk about powerful knowledge for the sea. So that's been a very nice situation. Now, we've got a few notes about Alaric on the back of the program tonight, and it does mention that when Alaric retired, he put an article in the South Australian Geographical Journal, but there is a subsequent one that was published by Cecile Coupler in 2018, and I want to just give you a few excerpts of this to fill out the information in the program. And it starts off in this way. The Order of Australia is not lightly earned. It's the most prestigious way this country has of recognising its outstanding community members, those who have made contributions that benefit society and country, and whose contributions encourage and inspire those who follow. It follows that for a geographer to achieve such an award for geography is a major consequence. And the citation which goes to the award acknowledges this as for significant service to education in the field of geography as an academic, researcher, author, and mentor. Then it's of fundamental importance that this society, the Royal Geographical Society of South Australia, also acknowledges the contribution of one of its own, Dr. Alaric Moore. So that's a nice way for this article to start. And there are a small coterie of geographers, academic geographers, who've also received national honours, but they're rather few and far between. And that's one reason why it's an honour to award this honour to Alaric. Anyway, the account goes on to say, Alaric is one of Australia's most highly respected geographers, and he's been a major contributor to developing a very strong school of then geography, population and environment at Flinders University at Bedford Park. And the previous discipline of geography. He was head of the discipline from 1984 to 89, and of the School of Geography, Population and Environmental Management from 1998 to 2000. While working at Flinders, he was a member of a number of senior committees, including Flinders University Council, which is the University Council, 1979 to 1985. Among other very varied administrative positions, he chaired the School of Social Sciences High Degrees Committee, 1986 to 1989, the Program in Population and Human Resources, 1987 to 1991. Well, the account goes on to talk about Alaric's interest in regional development, and it says that his interest not only encompassed Australia, but they also took into account various Pacific Islands and Southeast Asia as well. Then it goes on to say, and this is where it starts getting interesting, because we're not dealing with a normal geographer here, if indeed there is such a thing as a normal geographer. Alaric's geographic contributions extend outside the tertiary arena. He's undertaken a wide range of activities which have served the profession and increased its visibility in society. First, he served in a number of administrative roles for Australia's professional geography organisations. He's the Journal Business Manager for the Australian Geographical Studies from 1968 to 73, since renamed Geographical Research, and also the Secretary to the Royal Geographical Society of Australasia, South Australian branch, from 67 through 69. He was secretary of the national body for Australian Geographers, the Institute of Australian Geographers, from 2004 to 2012, and editor of the South Australian Geographical Journal from 2005 to 2011. He was a council member of the Australian New Zealand section of the Regional Science Association, and in 2013, this is an important one, took on the position of chair of the National Committee for Geography within the Australian Academy of Sciences. These contributions show Alaric's ongoing commitment to the discipline, academia, and to the community. So during the 1990s and early 2000s, and this is actually verbatim from the account, and because he clearly had nothing else to do, Alaric took on the complex and difficult task of co-editing a series of 14 books, which you might have seen, published as the Meridian series, Australian Geographical Perspectives by Oxford University Press. His commitment to ensuring the high quality of this series of books used extensively in tertiary and higher level secondary teaching was of great value to teaching staff who were looking for robust, relevant, locally written and locally focused materials that they could rely on at a time when the available texts had little material on Australia. Those words, I think, could be written again today in terms of local publishing. Alaric's been stunningly productive since his so-called retirement. He played a pivotal role in devising, monitoring and implementing the Australian curriculum in geography and was lead writer and writing coach for the geography curriculum and has continued to publish on the new curriculum and provide advice for teachers. And that's where we start to depart from some other recipients of the Thompson medal who have probably been more engrossed in their research. Work on the curriculum and teaching the teachers continues today. Alaric has recently published a series of articles on powerful knowledge and its relevance to geography. We're going to hear a bit about that tonight. These articles focus on ways of thinking and communicating, and he concludes, the concept of powerful knowledge provides a way to communicate geography to non-geographers, demonstrating that these ways of thinking and understanding are both educationally valuable and not taught in any other subject. So these are powerful words about the new approach to geographical education. Now, if I were thinking myself, from the view of Q, about powerful geographical knowledge, I'd be looking at the website of the CIA in the United States and the World Bank. This would be where I would turn, because I know there I'd find a list of all the countries in the world and all sorts of different variables. And it's a magnificent source if I can recommend it to any of you. But I think Alaric's penetration of powerful knowledge in geography is going to go somewhat beyond the World Bank and the CIA. So without any further ado, I'll ask Alaric to come up so that we can move on with the presentation of the minute. So Alaric, if you'd care to step up.
So this is the presentation of the Thompson medal to Alaric for 2020.
On behalf of the Society, please accept the Thompson medal with the commendation for your activities over the years. Thank you.
One more thing. So you also get a certificate. Of course, I'm sure you've got space in your bookshelves for another certificate. So, okay, just okay. Thank you. Round of applause. Round of applause. Okay, so thank you, David. That's the official part of this evening, the presentation. So now, without further ado, I will ask Alaric to come forward and give his address. I will just mention, though, that of course, yes, 37 years retiring, but as you just heard, his retirement has been probably more busy than when he was employed. And right now, in this trip to Brisbane. He is assisting Kath Berg and John Tasker, who are members of, and Julie Davis, who is also here, members of our Australian geography competition, to draft up some comments about the recent changes to the Curriculum Authority's review of high school teaching. And I think Alaric will just make a few comments on that at the start of his address. So over to you. Thank you. Thank you, Alaric.
And you all hear me?
Yes.
Yes, it's just been working. Right. Thank you for all those words. I feel somewhat exhausted at the thought of what's going on. But I have to say, being a geographer has been a terrific life. Opportunities to do things that I didn't dream of as a youth. And to keep on doing them, because there is much, I think, to be done. And I thank you for the award. The description of what you have to do to qualify for the award does not apply to me. I have done no service to this association, nor do I have a massive research output. So I thank you very much. I have read about your founder and been amazed at his energy and productivity, and discovered that we had one very small thing in common. We have both lived in Fiji, he as a surveyor and me as a colonial child. I do remember Fiji well with fondness. Before I talk about what I'm supposed to talk about, I want to say just a little bit about what's going on with the curriculum. As you're probably aware, if you read any of the press, the Curriculum Authority, ACARA, has produced a revision of all the school curriculums from the very beginning of primary to the end of year 10. And they produced a certain degree of controversy about the teaching of literacy and mathematics and history. Nothing that I've seen in the press yet has anything about geography, and that's not unusual because we're not one of the world's top controversial subjects unless we teach sustainability.
Just climate change.
However, the proposed revisions
Probably better.
It's hard to find a word to describe the revisions that is not an understatement. It's diabolical. I have heard it's atrocious. It's appalling. It's a travesty of geography. It's incoherent. And the geographic community has to do everything we can to make sure none of this gets in as a curriculum. It will, I think, destroy teachers, destroy the subject. Some of it, I have no idea what it means, some of the things that are said. So I'm trying to drum up support, which I know is there from all the teacher associations, I think, around the country who are informed. I've written to 5 ministers of education to try and send a rocket from the top. And if any of you know your minister of education here, go and trip her up and tell her that this is just not feasible. If you have a look at it, and it's not always easy to find it, I think you will be appalled at some of the wording of things. Some of it is plain wrong, some of it's incomprehensible, and much of it destroys the logic that was behind a number of the units that were created originally. Anyway, that's not what I'm here to talk about, but it's what I'm rather enraged about at present. So what I want to talk about is something I've been trying to get my head around for a few years, this idea of powerful knowledge and what it might mean for geography education in schools.
Is it on?
Is it on? Yeah.
Yep.
Thank you. So this guy, Michael Young, professor of sociology at the Institute of Education in London, has written over a decade or more about his idea of powerful knowledge. And he talks about this knowledge, which we're going to try and unpack, as something that all students should be entitled to learn in schools because of the abilities and knowledge it will give them to participate fully in our societies. And it's been an idea picked up by an educator in New Zealand and applied to the sort of knowledge that should be taught to Maori and Pacific Islander people in New Zealand. It's been picked up in Australia in relation to vocational education, and particularly in sort of criticism of an education that's purely about competencies and skills rather than much broader knowledge. And geography educators in the UK and a number of other countries have been quite interested in this. There are at least 2 recent books for geography teachers in Britain which go into the idea of powerful knowledge. It's been talked about in the US, Finland, Singapore, a number of places. Trying to understand what it really means gets a bit confusing, I think, because I can see in Michael Young's writings at least 2 different ways of interpreting it, but they're connected. So one is what he talks about, knowledge that is fallible, testable, but at the same time, the best knowledge that we have at present. And it's the best knowledge we have at present because it's produced by academic communities. It is criticized, peer-reviewed, checked, and until it's disproved or improved upon, it's the best we've got. And this is an idea which is in opposition to, say, constructivist or relativist views of education and knowledge, which says any opinion is as good as any other because we have no way of knowing which is better. And Michael Young belongs to a school of thinking called social realism. And the realism part of it says there actually is a real world out there, independent of how we perceive it. We try our best to try and understand that world. Our knowledge is a social construct, so that's the social part of social realism. But because there's a real world out there, there's a check on this. It's not just enough to say, the world out there is the way I think it is. There is a real world out there that says, well, you're wrong. And someone else says, I've got a much better view and I can test it against what is reality. So it's a fairly strong statement about knowledge. It's also an opposition to a sort of traditional view of knowledge as our received wisdom and not too open to being criticized, which might have been the case in schools a long time ago, maybe sometimes now where we're told we should be teaching factual history and there's no debate about what that history is. Well, there's a lot of debate about what our history is. And there's a lot of debate about what things geographical are. So powerful knowledge is in between. It says knowledge is really important. We should be teaching kids knowledge, not just generic skills or competencies. And it's something that they're entitled to. The other idea of powerful knowledge that comes out in Michael Young, and there's a long quotation from him, is that what is powerful about knowledge is the power it gives to young people, the things that enables them to think and to do. And a lot of his ideas are packed into that. This is the view of powerful knowledge I prefer, because it's something I think you can turn into things that teachers can work with and the students can follow. The idea of powerful knowledge being what academics produce is helpful, but it's not sufficient, because there's a lot of what academics do that is not relevant to schools. It's not particularly useful. It may be accurate, but it's often fairly esoteric. So I've got this little list of 5 dot points about what I think are the key ideas of powerful knowledge that we can work with. And I'm going to go through the first 3 of those and how they relate to geography. But if you can do the first 3, and you have that 4th one, which is a fairly generic power, you can do the 5th. You then have the equipment to deal with current debates on a range of things where geography is relevant. The question that I can't answer is, at what stage do you say these are powerful? That's a very subjective thing. But I'll try to give you some examples where I think it's indubitably powerful. So, and I'll try at the end to illustrate some of them with a few examples from Queensland research. So the next step is, what makes this powerful knowledge, these ways of thinking, explaining, and whatever, geographical? And going back to the lecture I gave a year ago, I would say it's how they relate to geography's concepts. So, new ways of thinking. If the new ways of thinking that we teach students, things that they may not have thought about before, change their ways of thinking, their values, their attitudes, maybe even their political attitudes, or their willingness to become active in something like environmental movements or social justice. I think that's pretty powerful. And there are a whole lot of things, I think, in geography which have that quality. Well, this is one. The photo was taken only 2 days ago, and I thought I could sneak it in to show that I have been to Queensland. And it was a very interesting little trip we had out there. So, one of the statements that I've invented there about place, I think is one of the, basically very simple or obvious, but I think it's very powerful for geographers, that each place is unique, which means that the same environmental process or same socioeconomic process like migration has different outcomes in different places because it's interacting with a unique set of circumstances in each place. Things don't always turn out the same everywhere. And in a country like Australia, trying to solve the same problem or what seems to be a similar problem the same way doesn't work very well. We are different. People think differently. The environment is different. So in that old phrase that geographers love, place matters. And I think one of the most powerful ideas we bring is the idea that place matters. Don't overgeneralize in your policies or your prescriptions. Environment. Now that statement there is what I would hope a student by the end of year 10 would understand thoroughly and be able to give you examples of how each of those things works, all of those ways in which the environment supports us. And if you fully understand that, I think you will be an environmental activist. You will know that we are overloading environment with wastes. You will know that we're no longer maintaining a safe habitat in terms of climate change or ecosystem services. You will know that we're using up some of the raw materials faster than they can be replenished. That seems to me to be a powerful set of ideas which would hopefully impel people to then do something about it. This one from space. That to me expresses in a sense, a geographer's view of inequality. That the map below is for Greater Brisbane by, I think, federal electorates, showing the differences in levels of socioeconomic advantage and disadvantage. And we know from research that places which are disadvantaged tend to perpetuate that disadvantage. So the more one could even out the differences between places, probably the less inequality will be perpetuated. And we tend to be, I think, a rather unequal society. I was reading a book this morning, and we don't do very well on inequality compared to a number of the European countries, and particularly, of course, to the Scandinavian countries. We have an extremely unequal education system. And I'll give you one little example from Perth. A couple of years ago, two people studied what subjects were offered in Perth high schools at year 12. And if you looked at the top 40% of socioeconomic areas, all but one of the 48 schools offered all the subjects that would get you in to the professional courses at university. If you took the bottom 20% of socioeconomic areas, only 3 out of 24 offered those subjects. So a kid in those areas isn't being given choices to start with. Whether they want them or not, I don't know. But that's an example of this socioeconomic inequality, which then perpetuates inequality. Interconnection. The Australian geography curriculum in schools is one of the few that has this as a concept. And I think it's one of our most important ones, in that there's an old definition of geography called geographers. Geographers are people who couldn't decide what to specialize in. And that's partly, I think, because they think in interconnected ways. They follow leads, they follow cause and effect relationships in a broader way than many other disciplines do, which, as talking with John Holmes earlier, is one reason why vice chancellors have no idea where to put geography in a university, because it doesn't neatly fit, keeps on breaking out of its boundaries. So the idea that nothing exists in isolation, there's all these interconnections, and that places are influenced by their relationships with other places. These to me are powerful ways of thinking that not every other subject has, many of them quite myopic. Now, geography is often described in the education sociology as a horizontal subject compared to a vertical subject. A vertical subject is one where ideas and theories build from the base up until you have a very grand idea like evolution at the top. And it said that geography is not like that, because we've got all these little branches and our knowledge doesn't build consecutively. And that is seen to be, in a sense, a conceptual weakness in the subject. Now, my next slide is an attempt to suggest, if you work from the top to the bottom, that we do have vertical progression, not to a grand theory, but to bigger and bigger ideas. So we start with early primary on weather, we add seasons. We then combine the two into climate. We then look at climates around the world spatially and see, all the Mediterranean climates seem to have a similar location relative to land and sea and latitude. We then get into, well, what does climate do? Well, it affects the vegetation, it affects us. And then we affect the climate. And you build that up and bring up other strands from the environment, and you end up with a very general statement at number 9 about the significance of that biophysical environment. A broad statement that packs an awful lot of information inside it, if you are to show that you actually understand what that means. Now, you can do that for some human geography, I think, and it's something I'm just playing with. I don't get the idea that we are a horizontal subject with no progressive development, particularly when you're trying to look at the school curriculum. Is there progression of ideas that accumulate? So, another part of powerful knowledge, can you better explain and understand the natural and social worlds? Well, we use the concept of space analytically, constantly, in mapping and spatially organizing stuff. GIS enables us to do it in a more sophisticated way than used to be a possibility. We use scale to test relationships, because they're not always the same at different levels of scale. And one that I quite like, used it, using place to tease out causal relationships in variables. And I want to give you a brief example from research I once did in an amazing part of the world, the highlands of West Sumatra. This is an area where, when I went there, I was studying migration. It's an area famous for migration out, has been for well over a century. And the general explanation in the literature that I got was, it's because it's a matrilineal society where land ownership and families pass through the female line, although the head of the household was always a male. But the head of your household was your mother's brother, not your father. And if you were married, you had almost greater responsibilities for your sisters and their children than for your wife and their children. So it was said that men got so confused by all this, they decided to migrate to parts of Indonesia which were patrilineal. There was a tension. What the locals said to me was, there's no tension. The two traditions of Islam, which is patrilineal, and their traditional culture, which was patrilineal, were complementary. What one tradition neglected, the other upheld. Case settled. So, I selected 11 villages. I had a group of Indonesian English language students. They did a whole lot of surveys. We collected several hundreds of cases from households. And I had these variables by village: the rate of migration, the selling of agricultural produce, the ability to sift from your own food, and education. Now the village on the left, which was the village of Rau, had 60% of males in my households had been or were migrants. The village on the right, Sumatra, 31%. Looks a bit more spacious, and it was. Being in those days a well-trained geographer of statistics, but not understanding it at all, I did some analysis. And what I found was that the ability to earn money through growing crops and selling them, and the ability to live from your food production, if you put them into an index, they correlated remarkably well with the rate of migration. And interestingly, that agreed with what the people said. Why do you migrate? Economic opportunity, they said. And those were two measures of economic opportunity. So this is using places to enable you to bring together an independent variable, which was the rate of migration, and the various other variables that enabled you to explain it and come up with something that seemed to be reasonably convincing. At least it got published. So we can't, in geography, unless in parts of physical geography, we can't do experiments. But you can select places and measure attributes of them like they were an experiment to get some useful answers. So using the concept of place as an analytical method, I think, is quite powerful. There's a few more ways of explaining that use our core concepts. And I like to think of interconnection as being the underlying concept behind all our studies of processes and cause and effect relationships, because they are sets of interconnections, some of them quite complex. I like that because of chain migration being what I've been studying in Sumatra. It's a good one to look at, because migrants go from the village to local centres in Sumatra or further afield to Java. Many of them did quite well. They send back information to the village and migration continues. And interestingly, I discovered that in South Australia, as you're probably aware, places like the Barossa Valley have this long history of German settlement. And we're always told it was because of religious persecution. Well, about the first 10% were. But they wrote back and said, this is a great place. There's land, come. And the next lot were all economic migrants, not for religious persecution. So that was a classic chain migration where migrants fuel the process by sending information, sometimes money back to pay for the next group. So that's thinking, I guess, of all the interconnections that are going on that is sustaining this pattern. And then generalizations. There's a generalization. Now, those of you who know me will know that I'm definitely not a physical geographer, but I did check that one out with a coastal geomorphologist, and he said, yep. And there's a nice example there of it from the coast of Adelaide, where breakwaters have stopped sand movement going north, which is up, and produced dreadfully eroding beaches the other side. So now we have to truck sand from one end of the beaches along, it's about 30 kilometres of beach, truck it the other way so that it can then be gently blown back again. Very expensive and not great for traffic. But if you understand that idea, which is a combination of concepts, if you understand that idea, you can look at all sorts of coastal areas and say, yes, you could build a marina there, or no, you couldn't. The problem is developers and politicians usually don't listen until it's too late. So, to Queensland, just a few examples. Now, I didn't know that John would be here tonight, so this is not put in at the last minute. It was there because I thought it was interesting, and he now has the opportunity to disagree with my interpretation. Anyway, I read it and I thought, this is an illustration of the concept of place. Because John divides Queensland into these two zones, very narrow coastal zone, and then what's left, which is the inland. And then explains the economic history of these two areas and how that changed over time. So it really takes these two zones, which we could call places, they're big places, but in geography, a place doesn't have to be just Malene, it can be a whole country, if you wish. And going that way, you get, to me, a very geographical interpretation of economic history as government policies change the relative value of certain activities. So at one stage, it's the inland that's doing well and the coast is rather neglected. Then the two become closer together as dairying and sugarcane gets developed along the coast, and there's smaller settlement inland. And then pastoralism starts to die back, and the coast suddenly gets reappraised as having all sorts of new opportunities, and settlement rapidly grows up along the coast. So we have a place-based view, and then other ideas like perceptions, and of course the interconnection between the interior and the coast, in which much of the, I guess, the wealth being generated ends up on the coast. So that's one example, I think. Space, Steve Turton's presidential address about the poleward expansion of the tropics. The spatial idea, what does this mean to our lives in Australia, for example, as the tropics expand south into regions and change the climate and change our possibilities. So looking at climate change, but turning it into a very spatial way of looking. A very small study by Lisa Law, but one that intrigued me partly because I have a son who had lived in Cairns for 20 years with a small architectural practice. And in successive visits, I got some idea of the trials and tribulations of controlling a garden in Cairns. But what Lisa found, a not untypical idea, that where people had come to a tropical area from places like Sydney and Melbourne, they struggled to work out how to create a garden that satisfied their aesthetics, which were temperate and would survive in the tropics and not be completely overwhelmed in 6 weeks. And where, when they went to Bunnings to see what they should plant, it was all imported from south. So we have this, I guess, the problem of adjusting to a new environment, which has been a hassle for European Australians ever since 1788. We're still trying to learn what it's really like. And I suggest what was going on in Cairns Gardens is an example of a much bigger issue, the dominance of Melbourne and Sydney over most of the rest of the country, and thinking that only they know what things should be. I think geographers ought to always resist the idea that we don't need the states. We may not like the states, but if we were all ruled from the federal government, it would be a disaster. So, another one that I loved when we were doing the Academy of Science work was the work done on the Lockyer Valley by a few geomorphologists, which really interesting example of how their ways of thinking produced much more practical ideas about flood control than the engineering type of solutions that existed. And there's a lovely article by Jonathan Knott on geomorphological blunders by politicians in Queensland, which is well worth reading. And then a final example, work of Thomas Stigler and his colleagues on global cities and global city networks. Now, I struggled to follow some of that because it's technically quite tricky, and I'm not sure that I got it always right. But basically what I think they were arguing was it was an opposition to our politicians and leaders' love of global city rankings. So what they're saying is that every city in Australia is global to some extent, and cities are global in very different ways. They each have their own special networks. They belong to different scales of networks, some local, some regional, say covering the whole of the Asia Pacific, some global. But all of them are in some way global. And that if you're trying to make your city more global, you've got to understand what your city is actually like. In other words, go local to place if you're going to be global successfully. So don't bring in ideas that seem to work somewhere else. What is it that specifically about Brisbane that will make it more global or attract the sort of industry it can? And that is going to be quite different to some other city. So in several of the articles, the recent articles about global city networks, there's this refrain: we have to think of place and recognize the local in our global. So, to get towards the end, well, this is the end. I think powerful knowledge is not about what you know, but that is an absolutely vital basis for being able to have powerful knowledge. But it's what you do with what you know. Can you use it to analyze, explain, understand, think about things that you've never seen before and make sense of them? because you've got this body of conceptual knowledge that enables you to do it. Can you answer questions and solve problems? One of the things that sometimes frustrates me looking through a school textbook, for example, is you'll see maps and distributions, and it's, can you explain this distribution? But we don't often get into talking about how do geographers use spatial distributions to understand what's going on in the country. Because let's take the process of urbanisation. The whole world is urbanising rapidly. And you can analyse a change in a country by looking at the structure of its economy. You could look at its political institutions and how they might evolve. But if you look at it spatially, how is it changing? What is going on in urbanisation? And how is that affected? And why is urbanisation such a sensitive indicator of a whole lot of other changes? It's like a litmus test that tells you there's a whole lot of things going on. Societies are being changed by being urbanised. Rural areas are being transformed. It's our way of showing, I guess, change in a country. And it's far more than just looking at a map. It's then using what you see there to dig into what's going on in that country. So powerful knowledge becomes geographical when it's based on our core concepts and the ways of thinking that they contain. And I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Alaric. So it's now time for questions. Any questions from the floor? Questions from the floor, and do we have any questions on Zoom? No. So questions from the floor. Okay, John, thank you.
Yeah, Alaric, I've been out of touch about secondary school curriculum for 2 or 3 decades. Can you clarify that the role you played earlier was to create a national curriculum, and to what extent did that come into force? And is that now being displaced by this one, which you had some rather strong words about? Now, can you link those things together a little bit?
So I think around 2013, we produced, well, I don't say we, ACARA, the National Curriculum Authority, produces the curriculum. And hundreds of geography teachers and others contributed to that. That came into effect in schools right across the country. And it's being taught, Julie can tell you a lot more than I can, it's being taught all around the place, from very early years of primary to year 10, and there is a senior secondary which is less implemented. Some states revised it in their own way, roughly I would have said according to their sense of state superiority. So New South Wales has the greatest changes because, well, they're New South Wales. And little old Northern Territory in South Australia made no changes whatsoever.
Queensland didn't make any change.
No. Western Australia's played some minor ones. Victoria actually improved the national one by getting rid of some of the mistakes that were still in it. They were not produced by us and the teachers, but by the bureaucrats and the current. They had a habit of sticking sustainable in all sorts of places where it didn't belong. They thought it sounded nice. Now, currently, the National Curriculum Authority, ACARA, had been told to revise the curriculum to reduce clutter, to reduce content, particularly in primary, to make it clearer for teachers, but not to make major changes. It was trying to keep it much the same because I don't think schools wanted a major change. They put a lot of effort into learning how to teach what they've got. But some schools, some principals, some states thought that particularly the primary was too overcrowded. So months ago, maybe, these revisions were put on a website for consultation. And they're only for consultation, but the CARA's expectation was that they would be implemented in schools next year. I cannot see it happening because there's been furore in the teaching of English, the teaching of maths, and some of the history.
And science.
And science. I think they did it in-house. They didn't listen much to geography teachers. They consulted them. From the experience I had when we did the first lot, ACARA is very resistant. But there's no one in ACARA who's a geographer. There's bloody historians that have been wrecking our lives for so long. Any historians here? My theory is that historians can't get jobs, so they end up in curriculum. Geographers can get jobs, so they don't go into teaching where they're desperately needed. So you find in many schools, there may be 5 people teaching geography. 1 might be a geographer and 4 will be a historian, or worse, if that's possible.
It is. Across Australia, 62% of geography teachers are out of teaching.
Yeah. We have on the one survey that I'm aware of, we have the highest percentage of untrained, geographically untrained teachers of any subject.
Except technologies.
Yeah. So, yes, the curriculum is alive and well. My impression is it's reasonably successful, accepted by teachers, which is in Australia, and we don't want to change them the way they're trying. It's fine.
If I could just add to that, Alaric's quite right. And when he says teachers were consulted, I use that term very lightly. There has been some consultation at the national level with the Australian Geography Teachers Association. Some states have provided some feedback, much of which has not been actioned. And it's now open for public consultation. So our job now is to get teachers to provide that feedback so that we get a large body of feedback to hopefully have some influence on what ends up being produced.
I honestly believe that the only way this curriculum can be revised sanely is to take it away from the car and hand it to a body of people who actually know what they're doing.
Yeah.
Other questions on the floor? Okay, Jennifer.
Take the opportunity to ask Alaric a question. The first thing I'd like to mention, Alaric, is that in that social realist position we take, I was recently referred to the philosopher Richard Rorty's book, which I think is called Objectivism, Relativism and Truth, in inverted commas. And in that book, they take a halfway house between realism and relativism in terms of pragmatism. And that is what you're really saying, I think. You're saying that there is a body of knowledge, but it might not necessarily be a direct fit with reality, but it's always got the opportunity to be improved as we get our models more totally aligned with reality. So I just thought I'd mention that one since I got introduced to it only a little while ago from England. But the second thing, and this is more commentary question, I dare say, is to talk about levels of systemic resolution, because geographers are pretty good at that. We talk about the local through to the global, and often explanation comes in at different levels of systemic resolution. And until I got to the stage of looking at things as systems, which is again going back to a school from the 70s, when geography got more systematic, it might have become difficult to think about vertical arrangements. And that 9 stages you had there is a pretty perfect demonstration of working the way up to the highest level of systemic resolution, which was an expression of the biophysical world. So there have been quite a few interesting things that you're talking about there, and I think that many of the things you've said, although they come into the school curriculum, actually touch on much higher level ideas that go around in geography anyway.
Thank you. Yeah, I have been noticing stuff on pragmatism and mentally making a note to try and avoid it. So I'm still trying to cope with the rest. But yes, it's something I should follow.
Anyone else have a question? No questions on the Zoom?
Just a comment.
There's one comment from someone on Zoom. From Les Isdale. In a complex society, differences can generate fear. But by showing the variety of ways geography illuminates differences, we have a pathway to appreciation of differences. From Les Isdale. I think it's a compliment to what you were saying, Alaric. I have one question, if I may, and going back to the idea of powerful geography, would you say that geographers' liking of field work is one of our powerful ideas? Because I'm not sure other disciplines do field work, archaeologists and so on, probably not historians. But I think that's one area of geography which very often attracts young children right through to university students. That it correlates exactly with what you're saying about place. We go out there and have a look at real place. So would you say that's one of our powerful ideas?
Well, when you put it in the context of place, and field work is investigating a very special particular place, and seeing what you can learn from it. So it's not an experimental approach, it's not a philosophical theorizing, it's going out and saying, what is this place like? What's going on in this environment? Getting down to the particular. Yeah. What I would say though is that we then have to, and we always have, I guess, try to see, well, how does that place, what does it tell us about some other place? What are the commonalities that we can make, say, a generalization about? Place is important. I don't think we wanted to go back to, I guess, geography of the early 1900s, where every region was special, distinctive, and there was nothing much you could learn from them other than learn what they were like and reproduce it. There's another way of using those regions and places.
I hope there's a space in the curriculum for particularly primary school students, you know, for doing a little bit of field work, because I think it does really engage kids, and you'd know better whether it's there
Well,
or not.
Daphne, there is, but it might not last.
Oh.
We don't put our foot down on the current review.
Okay, well, in a moment, we'll call for a vote of thanks to Alaric, but just because we've been having this discussion about the changes in a current zone, I'll say that RGSQ will be developing up a response separate from the teacher organisations to send through to our politicians, education ministers and so on, and to our current CEO about our feelings about those changes too. So the society will be involved in making a response, probably along the lines that Alaric has indicated. So look, at this point, I think we should move a vote of thanks. And I've asked Kath Bird to do this. So thank you, Kath.
It's somewhere the light isn't shining in my eyes. So it's my pleasure to thank Alaric for his address, which I'm sure has been informative and also inspiring. However, what I really want to use my public platform for is to thank Alaric for his incredible devotion and commitment over many years to making the Australian geography curriculum as good as the bureaucrats let us make it. I started working with Alaric about 15 years ago when we lobbied politicians so that Alaric represented the Institute of Australian Geographers, me from the Society, and working with teachers from the Australian Geography Teachers Association. So we lobbied politicians to include geography in the national curriculum, because at that stage they were talking about it only being English, maths, science and history. And then we worked together on a major project which put us geography ahead of the curve in the development of the curriculum, and it made me that geography teachers all around Australia had a really big input into the development of the curriculum before I even started on it. Alaric then went on to play a leading role in the development of the curriculum. I always realised how incredibly fortunate we were that we had a geography academic of Alaric's calibre who was willing to put in the enormous number of hours that he did to improve geography education in schools. And so it still continues. Alaric's address tonight has demonstrated how deeply he has thought about the way that an understanding of geography's underlying concepts gives students a powerful tool to understand and negotiate their world. It's dispiriting that we have to keep proving this to the powers that be, but we do, and it's a battle worth fighting. So, Alaric, I could just give you a little token of appreciation here.
I think it's a South Australian one, but before you go back, South Australia.
And please, oh, okay. Sorry, I think we're having a handing over photo here. Okay, handing over photo, right?
Oh, somebody's out of focus there. What are you doing? Right.
Fine. Okay. Okay. So please join with me to thank Alaric.
Okay, thank you, Kath. And once again, thank you, Alaric, once again for doing a double for this medal this time, last year, and coming up to Brisbane from Adelaide. And we're so thankful that we didn't have a lockdown here, so he could come this time. Now I'd like to invite everybody to join us for supper, which has been carefully prepared very nicely by Kay, John and Mary Knoll there. So thank you again for coming tonight and enjoy supper. Thank you.